We are grateful to everyone for joining us today from many different time zones, territories, communities, and nations. I myself am coming to this event from atop what is known as Burnaby Mountain, where I work and live, and from where I give this short introduction to the invited speaker for today's colloquium. In the registration information for this event, you are able to read about some of Dr. Bombay's many accomplishments. Dr. Amy Bombay completed her MA and PhD at Carleton University in psychology and in neuroscience. In 2014, Dr. Bombay joined Dalhousie University with a joint appointment between the Departments of Psychiatry and the School of Nursing. One of her many programs of research has explored the different pathways by which Indian residential schools trauma is transmitted across generations. More recent work also includes strengths, intergenerational resilience, which has garnered extensive media interest and has been influential in influencing policy and practice related to the health of Indigenous peoples. I could speak more about her work and her, but I expect, as is often done, she will also provide a self-introduction, which will help give important understanding to her work and what she will share with us today. Dr. Amy Bombay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the very kind welcomes and introductions, and thank you to Elder Marie for the wonderful opening and for being here with us today, and thank you for welcoming me virtually into the territory. So I'm just going to take a minute and share my presentation. All right, is that everybody seeing the presentation? Perfect. And I'm just going to start off by saying my dog was supposed to be in daycare today and it was canceled. And so she's here and I'm a bit concerned that she's going to lose her mind at some point. So if that happens, I'm going to pause it and attend to her and then come right back. So apologies ahead of time.
Yeah. You don't have it right now. Okay. Sorry, Ponchik.
All right. So I'll get started. So as described in the introductions, I'm here to talk about my research and the research of my team on looking at the intergenerational trauma and stress and the protective effects of culture in relation to health and wellness among First Nations people, and mostly speaking about mental health outcomes today. So to give you an outline of my presentation, I'll very quickly start by giving a little bit of background and context around health and social inequities in Canada and how they have been caused by historical and ongoing aspects of colonialism. And so with our research, we've been assessing the links between different aspects of colonialism, specifically the residential school system and the child welfare system, and looking at how they're linked with health and social outcomes. So I'll be giving an overview of that research where we've looked at the direct and intergenerational effects, looked at pathways by which this transmission of risk and resilience is passed across generations, and links between different historical trauma events, so between residential schools and the child welfare system. And then the last portion of the presentation, it will be giving an overview of our research, looking at how different aspects of culture and cultural identity are linked with health and social outcomes, primarily mental health outcomes. And I know Elder Marie mentioned this in the introduction, but I just wanted to note some of the content can be distressing for everyone, and especially for those who have themselves gone through trauma and stress. So please do, feel free to turn me off if you're feeling any distress, and I encourage you to do that and take care. Okay, so I think, as we all know, Indigenous peoples in Canada are made up of First Nations people, who within that group is a very diverse group representing over 600 communities. It's also made up of Métis people and Inuit people, but just wanted to start off by saying my presentation is primarily focused on the First Nations population in Canada, with a little bit of data looking at the Métis population. And I'll be pointing out the specific groups I'm looking at as we go through and go along. So first, to start on the background, I don't have enough time to really give a full overview of history in Canada, but I'll just mention the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, which was published in 1996. And it was really that report that led to a lot increased awareness in the general Canadian society regarding the health and social gaps that exist relative to the non-Indigenous population. And it also highlighted how these health and social inequities are very much linked with various aspects of colonialism, such as the residential school system. It also highlighted the importance of culture-based healing practices and wellness practices, and concluded that tinkering with existing programs and services would not be enough to foster substantial improvements in the health of Indigenous peoples. And it called for new and innovative approaches to addressing these issues. Unfortunately, many of RCAP's recommendations were not implemented. And over 20 years later, about 20 years later, we see these continued health and social inequities, like those described in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report, which also documents continued health and social inequities and highlights their links with intergenerational effects of residential schools and other aspects of colonialism. And in their calls to action, they had many of the same calls as were described in the RCAP final report years earlier. And so, again, I don't have time to talk about all of the things involved in colonialism, but very generally, it was an explicit attempt at assimilation and was really to get rid of what was referred to as the Indian problem at the time. And it involves many different harmful occurrences: the Indian Act, broken treaties, stolen land, forced relocations, and many more. Today, I'll be talking about policies that were explicitly aimed at assimilation and that were also specifically targeting Indigenous children in Canada. And so the Indian residential school system and the 60s scoop and ongoing systemic inequities in the child welfare system. So that's what our research has been focused on. And so I think most people in Canada are aware now of the Indian residential school system. It ran from the mid-1800s till the last school closed in 1996. And children who attended were separated from their families, communities, and cultures. We know that there was widespread abuse and neglect, and that many Indigenous children actually died while attending these schools. And it was also the cultural denial and cultural shaming was also a big part of the residential school system, and part of its attempts to take the Indian out of the child and to assimilate Indigenous peoples and take away their culture and practices. So we know from research in other populations that when children are exposed to these types of adverse childhood experiences, any types of adverse childhood experiences, that puts them at risk for various negative health and social outcomes. So just to give you an example, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study in the US assessed various types of childhood abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction, which included things like having a parent who used substances, being exposed to domestic violence, and a number of other examples. And what they found was, across a number of different studies, relationships between the number of adverse childhood experiences and negative health and social outcomes. They even found graded relationships between the number of adversities exposed to and the number of comorbid health and social outcomes in adults. So knowing what happened and what children who attended residential school went to, combined with this information, we would expect that those who attended would be at increased risk for mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety. And unfortunately, that is what we've found in our research, that residential school survivors are more likely to suffer from various negative health and social outcomes. And what our research has also revealed is, and what we've looked at, continued to look at, is the health and social effects in their children and grandchildren of those who attended. And so just to give you an example, this graph is from the First Nations Regional Health Survey, which is run by the First Nations Information Governance Center. It's a nationally representative population-based survey that's collected in First Nations communities across Canada. And this particular graph looks at the proportion of adults, First Nation adults, with moderate or high levels of psychological distress. And it's actually the colored bars that are representing the data from the RHS. And when we compare those whose families were not affected by Indian residential schools, so they didn't have a parent or a grandparent who attended, we see that they have the lowest levels of moderate or high distress. And when we compare them to those who were themselves survivors, so themselves went to residential schools, those who had at least one parent who attended, and those who had at least one grandparent attended, we see this increased risk for psychological distress compared to those whose families were not affected. And here the gray graph represents the non-Indigenous population, and we just pulled that figure from the Canadian Community Health Survey to give an idea of how that compares to the non-Indigenous population as well. So we see, even still in those not affected by residential schools, higher levels of distress, and we would expect that that could have to do with all these other aspects of colonialism that we're not measuring in this particular analysis. But those that are affected by residential schools, either directly or intergenerationally, are at this greater risk for psychological distress. So just to give you a few more examples, this is from the 2015-16 Regional Health Survey, with representing analyses in the adult population and the youth population. And it's looking at the proportion who seriously considered suicide at some point in their lifetime. And again, we see that those who had at least one parent or at least one grandparent who attended residential school, having these increased risk for suicide attempts or seriously considering suicide at some point in their lifetime. And we also found similar patterns for suicide attempts as well. Now I'm presenting data from the most recent Indigenous Peoples Survey that was done in 2017. So now we're looking at First Nations peoples living off reserve. And these sets of analyses was done with the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, which is a national First Nations organization focused on mental health and addictions. And in this graph, we are looking at the proportion of adults who have been diagnosed with mood disorder. Unfortunately, in this survey, they did not measure psychological distress, which is perhaps a more ideal outcome, because this might not be an accurate representation of distress levels, because these people actually had to have gotten a diagnosis and gone to see a doctor. But it's still, even still, we find these differences between those who had no familial residential school history and higher levels, a higher proportion being diagnosed among those with a grandparent, parent, or both the grandparent and parent who attended. And likewise, we found the same differences in relation to the proportion of adults with diagnosed anxiety disorders as well. This is going back to the data to our partnership with the First Nations Information Governance Center, where we're looking at data from First Nations living on reserve. And now we're looking at substance use outcomes. And we see even larger intergenerational differences when we look at some of these outcomes in relation. For example, in this graph, we're looking at binge drinking, cannabis use, and use of other non-prescription drugs. And we see that those with at least one grandparent or at least one parent reporting higher levels of these outcomes compared to those not affected. When we look at survivors who themselves attend residential schools, we actually see these levels actually didn't differ from those not affected. And we think, and we can discuss this at the end a bit more if there's interest, But we think this has to do, unfortunately, with the fact that many survivors who perhaps had poor outcomes have already passed on, and we think that might be explaining partly why they have these lower levels despite having really high levels of distress. We also think it could be having to do with a lot of survivors turning to culture, which sometimes involves not drinking or using drugs at all. And so that might also be people who have gone through a healing process and who have chosen not to use substances as well. But more research is needed to find out why that might be the case. And so just to give another example of First Nations adults living off reserve in relation to substance use, we see these higher levels of substance use, heavy drinking, and cannabis use in those affected by residential schools. And this slide is just to give you some examples of research that have been done in other populations who have experienced either individual stress and trauma or collectively experienced trauma by members of the same group. And it's just to remind you that these intergenerational effects that we're seeing in First Nations are not unique to Indigenous or First Nations people, but we see these same intergenerational cycles in other populations. A lot of the research that our work has been influenced by research done in the context of the Holocaust, where we see work being done that compares those Jewish people who have been affected and not affected by the Holocaust. And we see in the children and grandchildren these similar effects related to mental health, even though the contexts are very different. So some of our work, not only are we just documenting these differences in mental health and substance use outcomes, we also want to conduct additional analyses to find out who might be more at risk and try to find out some of the processes that might be involved. And so this is a study that we did, analyses of the 2008 and 10 regional health survey. And we looked at the First Nations youth who seriously considered suicide in the past year. And we compared those whose families were not affected by residential schools to those who had a parent attended. And we can see again, if we look at the total population, we see these differences where there's greater proportion among those with parents who attended. But when we looked at this outcome by gender or by sexual identity, that's a problem with this, with the 2008 and 10 survey. They actually don't distinguish between gender identity and sexual identity. And so that's something that we've been advocating for them to change. But when we looked at the variable that they used, we see that these intergenerational effects are particularly pronounced among young females, which goes in line with some of the data showing that First Nations females are at particularly high risks for suicide outcomes compared to when we look at the non-Indigenous population. Another analysis we did was look at these outcomes according to age category, where we compared younger youth to older youth. And again, we see this significant difference where the intergenerational effects are particularly pronounced in the younger age group, among those ages 12 to 14. And so we wonder if this might be representing an indication of early onset of mental health symptoms as a function of intergenerational trauma. But this is the only study we know of that has reported this. And so we are planning to do more research to see in other data sets if we're seeing a similar phenomenon. And if anybody else has ideas of why this would be at the end of the presentation, I'm happy to hear them. And so another question that our team really wanted to look at using these data sets related to intergenerational trauma is whether or not these intergenerational risks can actually accumulate across generations. We know within the context of the residential school system that many who attended within their families, they actually had multiple generations in their families. which would limit the opportunities for healing and for, across generations. And so what we did was we compared those First Nations adults living on reserve whose families did not, who had no parents or grandparents who attended, so serious previous generations who were affected by residential schools. And we compared them to those with a parent or grandparent who attended, so representing one previous generation who attended. And we compared them to a third group where representing those who had a parent and a grandparent who attended, so had two previous generations. And in fact, what we found was that those with the two previous generations who attended had the highest levels of psychological distress, which were higher than those who had only one previous generation. And as expected, those not affected had the lowest levels of distress. And just to note, this is another study we published where we looked at the same patterns in relation to suicidal thoughts and attempted suicides. And we found that same pattern where those with two previous generations were at the greatest risk. Another myth we wanted to address in our research was, I think there's a common myth in Canada that residential schools and other aspects of colonialism have only affected a small proportion of the population. And so we wanted to look at that using these national data sets. And this graph is representing the proportion of First Nations children, youth, and adults, so the whole data set, who have been directly or intergenerationally affected by residential schools. So either they attended or they had a parent or grandparent who attended. And as you can see, if we look across years, we see that about 75% of the First Nations population living on reserve has been either directly or intergenerationally affected by residential schools. And this hasn't really changed over the past 20 years. And this graph was used in a report that we did for the First Nations Information Governance Center that was seeking to advocate for continued funding for healing and cultural services for those affected by residential schools. We really wanted to make the point that it's not just a small proportion of this population that's been affected, it's actually a majority of the population. So now moving on to research that we've done, building on this work where we're exploring the pathways that are involved in this intergenerational transmission of risk for mental health outcomes in those affected by residential schools. And the first pathways that we looked at between having a parent who went to residential school and depressive symptoms was different stressors. So one of the questions we had was, do those with this parental background of residential school actually experience higher levels of stress and trauma compared to those not affected? And that's indeed what we found, was that those with a parent who attended experienced more traumas in their childhood, so more adverse childhood experiences, which in turn was associated with their increased number of traumas they experienced in adulthood, and also their higher levels of perceived discrimination. So those with a parent who attended residential school actually also perceived higher levels of discrimination from non-Indigenous people. And all three of these stressful outcomes and traumatic outcomes mediated the relationship in relation to depressive symptoms. And in this same study, not only did we look at the number and exposure to stress and trauma, but we also looked at whether or not that perhaps those affected by residential schools were more vulnerable to the negative effects of these stressors. And so that's what we found and this graph is showing the relationship between adverse childhood experiences and depressive symptoms. And we see this strong effect, but we see that this relationship is even stronger among those with at least one parent who went to residential school. So not only are they experiencing more traumas, but they're also more affected by these in relation to these mental health outcomes. And just to give you an example of the same pattern being observed in another group, this is a graph from a study that was done with Jewish people who had a parent who was in the Holocaust or whose family was not affected by the Holocaust. And again, in relation to depressive symptoms, they compared those who had been diagnosed with cancer to those who had not, and they viewed this cancer diagnosis as a significant stressor. And they found that when diagnosed with cancer, it was those with the Holocaust background that reported these particularly high levels of depressive symptoms, whereas those with the non-Holocaust background did not show the same increase when they were diagnosed with cancer. So this study is another study that came out a few years later, where we really wanted to follow up on the finding that children of residential school survivors are reporting higher levels of discrimination. And what we did was we invited First Nations peoples and we asked them if their families had been affected by residential schools. And we presented them with scenarios depicting both subtle and blatant scenarios of discrimination. And we asked them about their discrimination appraisals, which was questions about whether or not they viewed these scenarios as representing an incident of discrimination, whether or not, if this happened to them, they would view this as threatening or distressing for themselves, and also ask them about their current depressive symptoms. And what we found was that those who had a parent who went to residential school were more likely to appraise these scenarios as representing discrimination. They were more likely to appraise them as threatening, which in turn partially accounted for their higher levels of depressive symptoms. We also asked them about a particular aspect of cultural identity that's referred to as identity centrality in the literature. And it really is just representing the degree to which their Indigenous identity was important to their self-concept. And research in other groups have shown that this aspect of identity is often associated with higher levels of perceived discrimination because they're more likely to be constantly thinking about their background and maybe more likely to attribute any conflicts or negative incidents to their identity. So in fact, what we found was that those who had a parent who went to residential school reported higher levels of identity centrality, and that contributed to their greater, in terms of this mediation model, it mediated the relationship in relation to discrimination appraisals. We also found that those with the parental residential school background reported higher levels of past discrimination, and those past experiences of discrimination also was associated with a greater tendency to appraise these scenarios as reflecting discrimination. But although this mediation model isn't perfect and it can only look at relationships going one way, but in reality, what we think is that there's this kind of circular relationship, where past discrimination leads to an increased tendency to appraise certain scenarios as reflecting discrimination and so on, and that can increase potentially over time. And then we also just found a direct relationship between these past discrimination and depressive symptoms. So clearly the impact of racism and discrimination in our societies is very important for the mental health of Indigenous peoples and might call for some particular interventions that maybe focus on coping with these negative outcomes. Yeah, and we can talk a little bit about that at the end if there are any questions. So another pathway that we looked at in looking at the intergenerational transmission of residential school experiences is communication that those survivors had with their children about their time in residential school. And so a simple question that we asked a sample of First Nations adults whose parents went to residential school was, when did you first learn that your parent went to residential school? And what we found was that 36% reported that they had a parent who attended, that they first found out their parent went to residential school when they were children. Another 32% said they found out during adolescence, and the remaining around third of adults reported they didn't find out their parents went to residential school until adulthood. And so we wanted to look into this a bit more and see what are some of the themes around communication between parents and children in those families who have been affected by residential schools. And in response to questions about parental communication, we identified 7 themes in the children of survivors that they shared with us. And so one of the themes was over disclosure, where survivors, where the children recounted from their childhood that sometimes their parents would kind of talk a little bit too much about their story, about their traumatic experiences at residential school that maybe weren't age appropriate. For example, this person shared that my mother shared her experiences with me and it was frightening. As a child, I always felt sorry for her because the system had been so mean to her. I felt like a small adult when she told me these horrible stories. She would tell me these stories mostly when she would drunk and she would cry. I felt very sad and afraid. We also heard from some children of survivors who talked about whose parents didn't talk to them about their experiences, but they could still sense that their parents were dealing with outcomes of trauma. This person shared, I always knew my father went to residential school. We never knew why he was so angry or why he would never talk about what happened at residential school. I still have a hate for him, even though residential school was why he was the way he was. Another common theme was cultural disruption, where many second generation survivors shared that they have no knowledge of parenting or just no knowledge of their cultural practices. We also heard a lot of stories about cultural pride and how their parents or themselves have made concerted efforts to hold on to this cultural pride as a way of resistance and as a way of staying healthy. This person shared, I made a concerted effort with my own children to reintroduce them to our language and culture and to instill pride in their Aboriginal roots. Another theme was continued discrimination, both from non-Indigenous peoples and also lateral violence from other Indigenous people. This person shared, I grew up knowing I was less than white people. And another person shared, I see how we oppress one another. I don't want to buy into it, but I do. I do back to other Native people what they do to me. And a lot of us just don't like each other, and it stems from residential schools. And then others did talk about some positive experiences, but for the most part, when people talked about positive experiences described by their parents, it was also typically accompanied by some type of negative experience. Yeah, I recommend you read these stories and some of these quotes. I don't think I have time to read through all of them, but please do perhaps after the presentation. Another theme that we identified was just the theme of people making efforts for healing. This person shared, I dealt with all of those hard emotional issues and began to build my life as someone with self-esteem. I eventually settled into who I was, my culture, and learned about residential schools and started a path of forgiveness for those that had harmed me. So moving forward to another study that we looked at that was more, that actually addressed several questions, including looking at the issue of student-to-student abuse that occurred in residential schools. And if there's any questions about that after the presentation, I'm happy to talk about that. But in particular today, I just wanted to talk about one of the questions from this report where we looked at collective effects of residential schools and community, and so I'm referring to the not just the effects on individuals that I've already talked about, but the effects on whole communities. To give you an example of one of the themes that was identified by service providers who work in Indigenous communities, they identified effects on community relationships and lateral violence within communities as one example of a collective effect. This person shared, it is part of the systematic way that people in power used to teach us, the staff at residential school. They were abusers and they had to make sure we also knew how to be abusers. not only of other people, but to have hatred against ourselves. Abuse begat more abuse, and bullying was only one form of it. And today we see this in First Nations schools. Another collective effect is this kind of collective silence regarding residential schools and some of the contemporary outcomes of residential schools. This person shared it's not been safe for people to make those kinds of disclosures in their own families and communities. And that's also mirrors some of the individual level information that we heard from individual children of residential school survivors. So another potential pathway involved is actually biological factors. And this is not something our team has looked at yet, but there is one study that's been conducted by another team, and they actually looked at allostatic load, which represents the dysregulation of biological systems due to excessive wear and tear and activation due to stress. And in their particular study, they used a composite of 7 biomarkers across the cardiovascular, neuroendocrine, metabolic, and immune systems. And they again compared people based on whether their mother attended residential school, their father attended, their grandmother or their grandfather. And what they found was that those who had a mother attended, in particular, reported higher levels of allostatic load compared to those not affected and compared to these other groups, suggesting that there is potentially some type of involvement of biological systems in the transmission of residential school experiences across generations. A question I get a lot is about, is it possible that epigenetic factors are involved in the transmission of trauma across generations? And just very quickly, I think some of you likely know about epigenetics, but for those who don't, I'm referring to the kind of newer understanding in science that our environment can actually influence the expression of our genes. So while we're born with our genes and those don't change, our experiences can actually influence whether they're turned on or not, and can influence outcomes that way. And this graph is from a study done in the context of the Holocaust, where they again found those who had a mother who was affected by the Holocaust did show these particular epigenetic effects and differences compared to those who were not affected by the Holocaust, suggesting that epigenetics might be involved in these outcomes. Of course, there are other biological factors that could be involved, including genetic factors and other biological factors. I don't have time to talk about that today, and it's not really, I have other experts on our team that's more their expertise. But what we're doing, just to mention really quickly, our team is developing a training curriculum for First Nations around these different types of biological factors, so that First Nations communities can choose to make informed decisions about requests from researchers to participate in research that considers these biological outcomes. And so if anybody has questions about that at the end, I'm happy to speak to that. Just checking the time, I think I have a lot more to do, so I'm just gonna kind of move forward really quickly. The next question we wanted to ask in our research was whether the risk associated with certain aspects of colonialism can actually accumulate across different collective traumas. And this is a quote from Dr. Kermeyer, but it's been argued by many different experts that the child welfare system, through its large-scale removal of Aboriginal children from their families, cultures, and communities, be considered a continuation of the policies of the forced assimilation of the residential school system. And today we see that Indigenous children represent about half of children in the child welfare system, but only about 8% of the Canadian population. So huge, huge inequities that we're seeing there. And so we wanted to see statistically if it was possible to look at the association between being affected intergenerationally by residential schools and the likelihood of being affected by the child welfare system. And that's what we found, was that those with a parent who attended residential school was at the highest risk of being affected by the child welfare system. Those who had a grandparent were also at a greater risk, and those not affected were at the lowest. This is actually from the same study, sorry. So this is the same graph I just showed you, but we also looked at other household dysfunction variables like household economic instability, household general instability, household substance abuse, household mental illness, household suicide attempt, and household member in prison. And we found that across all of these outcomes, those with the residential school background had higher risk. And when we looked at a mediation model, we looked at how parental attendance at residential school is linked with an increased risk of being affected by the child welfare system. And we found that that association was mediated by the cumulative exposure. So adding up all of those different exposures to childhood adversity. So those with a parent who attended were more likely to be exposed to these different childhood household adversities, and that in turn put them at risk for being affected by the child welfare system. This is another study where we replicated that finding, that those with the residential school background are more likely to be affected by the child welfare system. And we extended these findings by looking at how personal involvement in the child welfare system is itself associated with depressive symptoms. And we did find that those who had been affected by the child welfare system were reporting higher levels. We also conducted a multivariate analysis where we're controlling for age, gender, and both the residential school system and child welfare system are included in the model, and both were actually remain significant in predicting depressive symptoms. We wanted to do a similar analysis among First Nations youth living on reserve using the regional health survey data, but they didn't actually ask about the involvement in the child welfare system. What they did ask about was whether or not youth are currently living with any biological parent. So whether they're not living with a parent, living with one biological parent, or living with both. And again, what we found was that those without the residential school background were the least likely to be living with none of their biological parents. And when we looked at that outcome in relation to psychological distress, we found that indeed, as expected, those who did not live with any of their biological parents are reporting the highest levels of psychological distress. And there's no difference between living with one or two biological parents. And again, our multivariate analysis also revealed that both having a history of residential school attendance and being personally affected by not living with either of their biological parents are both significant in predicting psychological distress. So I'm just being conscious of the time. I'm moving on to the last section of my presentation, which is really looking at the links between cultural identity and engagement with health outcomes, mainly mental health outcomes. So this was an early study that we did where we looked at 3 different aspects of cultural identity. The first one being labeled here in-group affect, and all that really represents is 4 items where we asked about the degree to which these individuals feel good about their cultural identity. And what we found was that was protective, and that it was associated with lower levels of perceived discrimination and lower levels of depressive symptoms. In contrast, when we looked at identity centrality, which I talked about earlier in the presentation, this aspect of identity refers to the degree to which someone considers their Indigenous identity as important to their self-concept. And we found this opposite relationship where more identity centrality is associated with higher levels of discrimination and higher levels of depressive symptoms. And we are assuming that these higher depressive symptoms are because of the higher levels of discrimination that they're reporting. But again, longitudinal analyses are needed to really see if that's the case. I'm just going to skip through a little bit. Here's another example, one of our recent studies that looked at a different aspect of cultural identity within the First Nations youth population living on reserve. And what we found was that, we looked at bullying as an outcome and looked at it in relation to distress, where more bullying as expected predicted higher levels of distress. But when we looked at it as a function of those having strong belonging in their community versus reporting weak belonging, we found that those with strong belonging were somewhat buffered against the negative effects of bullying when we look at psychological distress. So having stronger belonging can somewhat buffer against these negative outcomes. And this is just a graph from another research group who had looked at allostatic load in relation to perceived discrimination. And they found more discrimination, the more dysregulation in these biological systems, but that those with high cultural continuity, which was really a measure looking at engagement in culture, seemed to be protective of this negative outcome in relation to these biological systems. This is a recent study that just came out from our team, where we looked again using, this is from the Indigenous Peoples Survey, and that survey looks at 4 different aspects of identity. And we found that cultural group belonging, so perceiving belonging with one's cultural group and having high cultural identity affect, so high pride in their identity, was associated with a reduced likelihood of being diagnosed with anxiety disorders. In contrast, we found that cultural exploration was associated with a greater risk. And we found that cultural engagement, there was no association. So again, just to point out how it's important in this research that we're doing to look at how these different aspects of identity are associated with these different outcomes. Again, we found the same relationships between these different aspects of identity in relation to diagnosed mood disorder. But when we considered interactions with residential school history, we actually found that the protective effects of both identity affect, so cultural pride and cultural exploration, and cultural engagement, I believe the graph is not here, but for all 3, it was protective against having a mood disorder, but particularly for those with a residential school background. So it was more protective for those affected by residential schools. Again, we see differing relationships. Now we're looking at the outcome of heavy drinking with these same aspects of identity. And with heavy drinking, the only significant difference was with cultural pride. And if you recall, cultural pride was actually predicted of a lower risk of depressed mood. But in this case, it's actually associated with risk for heavy drinking in the past year. So it has this, so it seems to be protective for mood, but the opposite and risk for heavy drinking. And so that's something we also are trying to think about and why that might be the case. And if anybody has ideas or wants to discuss that afterwards, that would be great. And then this is the last graph from that study where we looked at past year cannabis use, and we actually found that none of these aspects of identity related for cannabis use. So again, emphasizing how these different aspects of identity can have differing relationships with different outcomes in different contexts. And this is the second last slide. And so this is a graph, I think from the 2015-16 regional health survey, so adults living on reserve. And we found that not only do these cultural variables are related with health outcomes, but also that those affected by residential schools are often actually more likely to seek out culture. So this, in this case, adults, youth, and children were asked how often they take part in community cultural events. And it was actually those affected by residential schools that were more likely to take part. And we also found that those affected by residential schools were more likely to report higher levels of belonging in their community. And these protective effects of identity were also consistent with our qualitative research. Just to share a couple of quotes from participants whose parents went to residential school. this person shared, "I think my mom showed me more than she told me. She's very traditional and has practiced our culture in front of me when she could. My mother remained a very traditional woman and has maintained her language. My mother has always been a very proud Native woman." And this was another person who shared, "I was ashamed growing up, but I've since reclaimed my identity. And now that I'm on my own, I have more pride and I'm learning to love my identity. I gave my son a traditional Ojibwe name and I vowed to raise him to be proud of who he is." So again, just emphasizing the importance of culture that was raised in many years ago in RCAP and is constantly advocated for by First Nations. And so we really hope that our research can support communities in their advocacy for support for cultural practices in relation to health and funding for these programs as well. And I'd just like to thank my partners, that the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, First Nations Information Governance Center, the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, our collaborators, Dr. McQuaid, Dr. Matheson, Dr. Anisman, and many more, and our funders as well. And so I think I'll stop sharing my screen and I'm happy to take any questions that anybody has.
There we go. Great. Thank you so much for that wonderful, wonderful talk. Deeply, deeply appreciated. So much to think about, learn, rewatch. We thank you for giving permission to record this, and so many references. It's very important for us. Before we open to questions, which we'll handle through the chat. People can type in their questions. Really, what we'd like to do in thanks is to present you with a scarf. This is actually not the scarf you'll receive, but I'm showing it to you because I and my mother both own these scarves. But this is a silk scarf made by Lisa Shepherd, a Métis artist who currently lives and works up the Stola River on the traditional unceded territories of the Kitsi and Kwantlen First Nations. The scarf is called Kichimiyamoyetin, which in Nehiyawan and Cree means honor. In this scarf, there are motifs of traditional beadwork of poppies, forget-me-nots, and dragonflies in a flow of an infinity symbol formation. With these elements, the scarf references people of the past and today who selflessly give of themselves. Your work on intergenerational transmission calls us to recognize and honor our ancestors and our culture. We are grateful to you for sharing this important work with us, Miigwech. So we now have a few minutes for questions before we end. At 1:50, we'll open up the chat now, where we'll ask people to type in their questions. Michael Schmidt will help identify questions, which he will pose to Dr. Bombay.
Okay, the first question that I see in the chat is from Ilaradanan, and they ask, "Thank you for an incredible and informative talk. I'm wondering if you can speak to how you've sampled Indigenous participants for these studies. Am I right that they were primarily secondary data analysis, and what were the sample sizes like? I ask because I know it can be difficult to obtain Indigenous samples and want to know strategies for doing more research."
Yes, that's a great question. And hi, thanks for attending. So yes, you are right. Most of those studies that I was presenting was using data from the First Nations Regional Health Survey, which is a survey that's run and controlled by the First Nations Information Governance Center. And I feel that data source is really underused, and I encourage encourage you to if you're working with some organizations or communities that have questions that can be answered by that data, to definitely what you have to do is put a proposal in, and it gets reviewed by FNIGC's national board, and that process it is really well planned, and you can get in touch with them for that. The other data set we use is previously known as the Aboriginal People Survey, now the Indigenous People Survey, and it's run by Stats Canada, and I know has a lot of Indigenous people who are running that survey as well, but it's different from the FNIG survey in that it's not completely meeting OCAP, but it's still a valuable data source. It has a lot of limitations. They both do, but at the same time, it's some of our best, our best data, as they're both nationally kind of representative of the First Nations population, RHS, and then the Indigenous People Surveys, actually First Nations, Métis, and Inuit living off reserve. And then a few of our studies were national studies where we collected data. I think there was just 1 or 2 studies, and that was, we just invited people from across Canada who identified as Indigenous to participate. And so that obviously has even more limitations than these other surveys we're using.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Colette says, the finding about greater cultural pride sometimes serving as a risk factor is really intriguing. Yeah, I agree. I wonder if somehow people being more connected to their culture means that they also have to simultaneously hold the reality of colonial violence that they have suffered. So they're sitting with pride, but also sitting with the enormity of the cultural trauma. I wonder if supporting people processing the trauma and supporting them and finding post-traumatic growth would help people reclaim and integrate their traditional identity in a more supportive way.
Yeah, that's a really good potential consideration. Absolutely. Another idea we were thinking, because when you look across the research, both within Indigenous populations and other populations where they've looked at that particular aspect of identity, it's pretty consistent that you find pride associated with positive mental health outcomes, but it was the only time we found the risk was in relation to substance use. And so one thing we also considered was maybe people without pride, or maybe more stigmatized around substance use, and people with pride are less influenced by that stigma. But I think your idea is actually a lot better and something that we want to look into more, because finding out, why these associations exist are really the thing that's going to inform interventions and more applicable information from these findings.
Thanks, Amy. Randy has a comment and question that I think is mostly about, like, what are some of the other things that you were controlling for in these analyses that could be potential confounds that could provide alternative explanations?
So we were always, we do simple analyses, then we do multivariate analyses where we would control for at least gender and age, and in some of the analyses, more factors, but we were always controlling for age and gender. And certainly, things like socioeconomic status is going to be involved in that, but we didn't want to control for that because that's probably potentially a mediator of those effects, where those affected by residential schools, you're going to see differences in potentially socioeconomic status in the next generation. So we really just wanted to control for the kind of set ones, because a lot of those other things that are usually controlled for can actually serve as mediators of these effects.
Thanks, Amy. Thema asks if there's more that you could share about protective factors, coping strategies, and healing.
Sure. Like I really suggest you look to the work of our partners at the Thunderbird Partnership Foundation, and they have a lot of publications around how culture is the foundation for wellness for First Nations across the country. And they have publications around how it's being used by communities to promote wellness in relation to mental health and addictions. And our work in partnership with them is really to provide this kind of, empirical evidence that is useful when you're talking to policymakers and funders, so that I would say we shouldn't have to do this. They should just, believe communities and these organizations that culture and identity is important, just as important or more than these other kind of mainstream medical approaches. And so we really just look at our research as supporting those arguments and providing evidence for that. But if you really want to look at examples of that, I would go to their research and publications on that.
Thanks, Amy. And I do have to note, there's a lot of things that are in the chat here, and I'm not going to be able to read through all these questions, so I'm having to curate a little bit. Please don't take it personally if I don't ask your question. I'm trying to, make sure that we hit on a multiplicity of topics and different questions. So this is an interesting one from Jennifer about whether or not you're aware of any studies looking at the relative protective effects of cultural connection that either include Indigenous musical practices versus those that don't. So just, I guess in some ways, maybe the question is, are you aware of anything that's looking specifically at song, drumming, and other forms of Indigenous music?
I am not. That would be really interesting. I am not aware of anything that has done that. Not to say that it hasn't, but I don't think so. I know Thunderbird has developed a questionnaire that gets a bit more specific with kind of specific practices and could potentially answer that question, but I'm not sure if they've actually done any analysis to kind of tease that out.
Yeah. I think it's a really interesting and right research question there. And I also know it's got real interesting sort of, real world implications, because things that I've heard about, a lot of times cultural reconnection programs, the place where they start is with a drum or singing, something like that. So people that are looking for interesting research topics, that could be a really fun one. Let's see. So this is a question from Liz about the role of language maintenance and cultural engagement and how that might relate to resilience and well-being.
That's a good question, and something that our team is currently trying to work on, because because both surveys do actually ask about language use, and from what I know of the literature that has been done so far, when you're looking at just correlational analyses, there's mixed results. But again, I think when it comes to explaining those relationships, it's really complicated, and that more, qualitative research is needed to really tease out what are, how language is linked to health outcomes and why, and assuming that those are going to change in different contexts and different communities based on history and ongoing issues. So yes, that's something that research really definitely needs to look at more.
Thanks, Amy. Natalie says, Miigwech for the presentation. Is the day school system included in the RHS statistics for the intergenerational effects of the IRS system? And have you looked at whether or not has a similar kind of effect intergenerationally?
That's a really good question. And recently they were considering making changes to the RHS. Currently, it just focuses on residential schools. But we did suggest that they potentially distinguish between different types of residential schools and comparing differently day schools. But they do not yet differentiate that or include day schools in the RHS, unfortunately. That said, our team's doing a pilot study in partnership with the 60 Scoop Legacy of Canada in Manitoba. And in our questionnaire, we actually did include questions about day school. So we might have some preliminary analyses looking at that in the next couple of months.
Okay, this is an interesting one from Sandra. I recently finished my MA on Indigenous dance as a social determinant of health and holistic well-being. That sounds like some good reading for you, Amy. I was wondering why I use the term perceived discrimination. Sandra's noting that people could understand that in a sort of problematic way, as if it's only perceived. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, so the scale is actually the perceived, it was a scale called the Perceived Ethnic Discrimination Scale that we piloted with some First Nations groups and changed it. And so it actually is just asking, what are your appraisals of it? And we can't speak to actually whether or not those happen. And we do see, different appraisals to it. But we certainly in that one study, for example, when we find those affected by residential schools are perceiving higher levels of discrimination, we're certainly not suggesting that those are just inaccurate perceptions. In fact, and we talk about this in the discussion, that it's also likely that we know that those affected by residential schools are more likely to have higher levels of identity centrality and engagement. So it's likely that they maybe are presenting as more Indigenous outwardly, and so they're actually eliciting more discrimination. So they actually are getting discriminated against more, and we definitely say that is definitely possible and probably likely. And so it's just the nature of our questions that they're actually asking about perceived discrimination, but that's not suggesting at all. And we make a point in our writing when we talk about it to say, that doesn't mean they're not, it's just the nature of these questions. And when we talk about the relationships, we look at all the potential outcomes.
Okay, thanks so much, Amy. Rochelle, I think we're at time, am I right?
Thank you so much. You read my mind. It's hard to draw this conversation to a close, but there will be continued conversation with Indigenous students who have pre-registered immediately following this. And so we need to move from this Zoom room to a different Zoom room. So for the Indigenous students who pre-registered for the small group conversation, see you in a few minutes in that second Zoom link you received via email. And really, on behalf of the IRC, the developmental psychology area, and the department, I would like to say a final thank you to Dr. Amy Bombay for accepting our invitation and for sharing your work and thoughts with us today. I would also like to raise my hands up and thank all of you, colleagues, students, community members, attendees from far and wide who have made time to join this event. With recent US and Canadian federal Supreme Court cases with challenges to tribal and First Nation sovereignty, this is an extremely important time to come together, listen, engage in learning and reconciliation. If you would like to learn more, feel free to contact us. You know how to find us. We look forward to seeing you again, perhaps at our next event with Dr. Adam Murray in 1 week today, who will be talking about going where the need is, psychological research in the context of reconciliation. So again, thank you so much. I've been studying some Nehiawa and Cree these past couple of years, so miigwech. And see you again. So Elder Marie and Dr. Bombay and the Indigenous students I'll leave this space. Cerise, you'll stop the recording.